Hello, everybody, and thanks for joining us for episode 2 of Shipping Accessibility Using AI. Joining me here today again is Wilco, and my name is
Hello,
Noe.
welcome. And today we'll be talking about something that might be almost a little bit heretical in the accessibility field. We are going to discuss whether AI is going to replace user interfaces. Are these going away? And if so, what impact does that have on accessibility guidelines? Do they become more or less relevant? What's happening with these?
Right, and I think the interesting thing about this question is that it's, in some cases obviously wrong, but then in other cases not that ridiculous. And there really are workflows where the UI becomes less central.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of my favorite questions that we're going to touch on in this series. But Noah, you've spent a lot of time thinking about AI systems, what they can do, what they can't do. Um, so with that experience, can you tell me what is the strongest version of an argument for why AI might be going away?
Right.
User interfaces make AI go away.
Right, yeah. I mean, I think the strongest argument is just in their capabilities that we've all seen. They're getting much better at doing tasks, and that includes user tasks. And if you've used Claude Code or Codex, you know now that they're very capable of locating certain elements on a user interface, interacting with them, and triggering actions in the user interface. And 2 years ago that was almost unthinkable, that their ability to do that, or to perform even a pretty basic task in a user interface, um, was severely limited. And now the complexity and length of tasks that they're able to do is increasing quite a lot. And I think with that there are also certain tasks that users don't really care about the interface. The interface is what or was necessary for them to accomplish that task, but what they really care about more is the end result of that task. And what we're seeing is that increasingly systems are exposing APIs or a structured workflow that agents can use directly. So I think with all of that in mind, there's a pretty large set of cases where the UI might not become the primary way of interacting with software.
So let me see if I understand. You're saying websites, apps, operating systems, these might be replaced or augmented through AI agents. Like the agent is going to do these tasks on behalf of users instead of them.
Right, exactly. Yeah, yeah. So, I think one of the examples that gets thrown around a lot is like using an agent to book your flights. If the all the flight information and the cost and all of that becomes available through an API that an agent can interact with, well, maybe you just tell an agent like, I want to go to Cabo, and I can go on these dates, and then this is roughly my budget. But go ahead and book it for me, and then it makes a bunch of API requests, and ends up being able to actually book the flight for you. So in that case, it's not that you care about the user interface to book the flight; you care about getting the flight ticket in your hand. And so that's a case where I think an agent might actually be able to fill in and substitute for a user interface.
Right, and I've done things like that. I guess I've used Claude to generate charts for amplitude. So rather than me having to go through that honestly rather confusing interface, Claude can do a really good job of doing that kind of thing for me. Um, what's really neat in that is it's able to not just get data from amplitude, but it's able to put the different sources of data together. So I can connect some GitHub information to my amplitude, or I can use some source code. Um, I can connect Claude to the source code of my project and to amplitude to try to figure out how these things interact. So I don't need to necessarily know all of the event names and all of the properties off the top of my head, or anything like that. That's been really helpful. Um, another way that I've used this is I regularly need to put expense reports in, and one of the systems I use for that is I need to track my the trains, like when was I in the train, how much was paid for that particular trip, and I've got a Claude skill that just tells it how to look up how much I've spent on that train trip to get the evidence for that, to pull that down, put it in a nice PDF that I can just share out rather than having to do that kind of work myself. That's been very helpful, actually.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's super helpful for like administrative or clerical tasks, repetitive or information heavy tasks, data structuring tasks. And I think for a lot of people, when the more a task is about getting a result, like an end result, rather than enjoying or directly controlling an experience, the more plausible it is that an agent can sit between the user and that product. So now let's talk about what agents can't replace at the moment. Wilco, where do you think this argument breaks down?
So, yeah, I think there's a lot of spaces where accuracy just becomes a critical piece. If I want get a flight booked, I kind of want to know that it's going to get it right. So I may not want an agent to fully book out that process, but it might be able to get me e- several steps into the process where all I need to do is confirm the information. That's a really helpful step. Um, there's also things where there's privacy sensitivity. I would never, ever, ever, ever give an AI agent the ability to purchase something for me. I always want that to be a thing that I do. Um, Plus, there's a lot of sensitive information about my banking history, information around insurance and health and these kinds of things. That it's information that, like, this is a third party provider that I'm sharing this information with, and I don't really know what it's going to happen to me. And even if there are policies in place, do I fully trust those kinds of systems with that kind of sensitive information? That's a difficult question and one that everybody needs to answer for themselves. So I can well imagine people wanting to continue to use banking through their banking app rather than having an AI agent figure those kinds of things out, even if it potentially is able to connect different things together and figure out ways to optimize your spending and maybe figure out where you might be able to cut um, or reduce your bills. Other things you already mentioned is if the experience itself is the point, places like Spotify, YouTube, Instagram, these kinds of channels are really the end goal. It's I don't imagine somebody ever wanting to go through Claude or ChatGPT to watch YouTube videos. That is just a very different kind of experience that you get. So these are systems that likely will they're not going to be replaced by AI agent systems. Creative tools is also an area where I wouldn't expect um, a generic AI environment to do the job, but we are seeing a dedicated design systems with AI being part of that, or dedicated coding system with AI being fully integrated into that. Um, so those are things where I think dedicated interfaces will remain relevant. Um, so many workflows may become kind of a hybrid where you've got some of your native things, the things that you're used to, alongside a chat interface and AI option. I think that's probably where it ends.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I could see that with the shopping experience, right? Like you tell it a little bit about the product that you're looking for and the what kind of specifications you want it to have, and then an agent goes ahead and searches through a catalog and narrows it down, and then like the UI is the last piece where you browse through the more curated selection of options. Um, but to add to what you said, I also think that people change more slowly than technology changes, especially these days. And even if these workflows become technically possible, there still may be a barrier to adoption, where people or organizations aren't fully comfortable with them yet. And I mean, seeing some of the mistakes that these agents can make, I still wouldn't feel comfortable anytime soon, like handing my payment information to an agent and having it book a flight for me. I would rather just still be in control of that process. So, it's going to take a while for the trust to build up there, I think, for people. But then in a way, you could also argue that, the agents themselves become a type of interface that through which users interact with software.
Absolutely. So the real question isn't, are UIs going away? It is, um, where do the UIs still matter, and where do these AI agents fit into this system?
Right. Yeah, totally. Totally.
So you made a point earlier, and I think that's quite important. These agents, they're not a traditional user interfaces, um, but there's a new kind of modality happening. What do you mean by that? Can you say a
Right.
little bit more?
Yeah, so for us in accessibility, we're always thinking about user modalities. A modality is a way that a person interacts with a system, and in software, we have all these different user modalities already that we have to consider, for accessibility. We have mouse accessibility, mouse modalities, keyboard modalities, touch, screen reader, voice, switch control, all of those different types of ways that someone can interact with software. And emerging now, we also have AI agents or chat workflows that are another modality. So the agent itself might not need to be accessible in the same way that a button does, but the experience of using the agent needs to be accessible. And in particular, the end result needs to be guaranteed to a user using an agent as a modality. Users need to be able to understand what the agent can and will do. They need to be able to issue instructions, review outputs, correct mistakes, confirm actions, and then recover from any errors that do happen. So if a company is responsible for creating an agentic user modality or enabling agentic user modalities with their software, then they also need to own the accessibility of that experience. So, if you create an AI workflow that users rely on to interact with your product, that's not outside of accessibility. That is part of the product experience that you're now offering.
That's an interesting take. I'm going to go a little bit off script here, Noah, and ask you, how would an organization do that if they want to, if they offer an AI agent, they offer an AI chat interface? How do you guarantee an accessible experience in that? How do you even get started on a project like that?
Right. So in when you're guaranteeing accessibility these days, you perform screen reader testing and keyboard testing of your software.
Sure.
In an agentic world, it would be the same thing. You would perform agentic testing of your software, especially if that's a user modality that you're intentionally offering through an API.
How does that work? So I'm building a chatbot. I want to make sure that the things that it offers is accessible. How can you test for that?
Right. I think it's not so much that you're building a chatbot, it's that you're building out the back end functionality through which a chatbot can interact with your interface, right? In the same way that an iPhone provides like voiceover, and someone creating an app on an iPhone has to use voiceover to test their app. It's that if you are creating an API that an agent can use to interact with your software, then you should probably, and this is all kind of at the forefront. We're thinking about what accessibility might look like in an agentic world. But I'm suggesting that companies would want to own every part of the accessibility, and that includes testing for agent accessibility and ensuring that a user who decides to use agents as their user modality has an accessible experience, and that it would involve testing all the possible workflows that are agent enabled. And probably what you could do too is test it with certain models or providers, and be able to verify that we have a very low error rate when with our agentic enabled interfaces, with these providers, and we've kind of got confidence in that.
Right. And so it isn't like because you've got an agent which may potentially offer an accessible experience, the UI now doesn't matter anymore, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Right. So I think it's time to look at the accessibility guidelines then. What I've been thinking about a lot is what changes in a world where you've got AI agents generating content, personalizing interfaces. From it seems to me like WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, become maybe even more important, not less so, in that kind of an environment. It gets more complicated to figure out what does it mean for this experience to be accessible when the content is fully generated. Like you can well imagine if I generate an article and I post it, and I can check the accessibility of that before I post it. That is on my responsibility to do that. It's an obvious thing. But what if that article is generated for the user with no human in between? That's becoming increasingly the world that we're living in. And I think in a situation like that, organizations have more work to do to figure out the different kinds of articles or images or whatever that's being generated to check the accessibility of those in the different scenarios that we've got. It's true for AI generated content. It is very much true for personalized interfaces. And for conversational interfaces where you're actively talking to an AI, um, there too, when your AI agent is not just outputting text, but outputting tables and complex graphics and things like that, those components that the AI agent uses, they need to be accessible too. So all of the principles that we've known from WCAG, achievable, operable, understandable, robust, they very much still matter. Um, but it gets more complicated, especially when you're talking about assistive technologies, when those are increasingly capable of addressing some of the problems that exist in accessibility. One of my favorite example of that is with language. Language detection has been around for a very long while. This is a form of AI, but not a large language model approach, where AI has for a long time already been able to detect what a content, what language a content is in, and the standard still says that the people creating the content are responsible for identifying that language. But the more tools are able to do this and to do this well, the less the content author is going to need to be responsible for these kinds of tasks. And I think where the guidelines are really get challenged is when you've got assistive technology that is mostly accurate, but maybe not 100% of the time. At what point do you say it's good enough?
Right, right. And that pattern shows up everywhere. AI can infer things, but that inference has error rates. So the question is not just can AI do it, it's how reliably can it do it, and in what context is that good enough?
Yeah, Yeah, and so UI are probably not going to go away. But the way people interact with software, that is very much changing.
Yeah, and accessibility doesn't become irrelevant; it expands, as we've talked about. We have traditional UIs, generated UIs, assistive technologies with AI features, and agentic workflows that users may now depend on.
Yeah, so companies that do well in accessibility are the ones that have this more holistic approach. Accessibility really isn't a checklist, and that becomes even more apparent in this AI world that we're living in.
Right, exactly. Yeah, your product may now be competing against an AI mediated interface. So the accessible and reliable path is the one that users are going to end up choosing.
Perfect. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We'd love to hear from you. Are AI agents already changing how you use software? Please leave a comment.
Yeah, thanks so much. And don't forget to subscribe if you'd like to follow the rest of the series.